right. So, um, we have in front of me here is the still life that we worked on together, um, doing our indirect painting method. So the burnt sienna, then building the open grisaille with the burnt sienna washes, and then the closed grisaille with the burnt sienna, ultramarine, and white, building up our form, and then now we are moving on to color. So I'm going to be first going over the colors in this photo, taking some time to look at what's happening in this photo. And then as far as color is concerned, we'll be going over the latter part of the handout, the color theory handout, talking about application and applying and some new basic rules that apply with color when working in color, and how to use color to unify with form, and how it works well with form, how to create depth and space using color. So we're going to be looking at those things, going over those basic principles and finding examples in this photo. And then after that, there will be a demo in this video of me painting this still life on top of one of the in-class demos that I had been using, right on top of it in color. And then after that, we will review the painting together and take a look at it and see, where it was successful and where maybe it fell short, or just things that happened while I was doing it, so we can take advantage of that. So I'll be working in this manner, where I'll be drawing directly on the photo as I talk, so you know what I'm talking about in what area, similar to how I've been giving you feedback in your critiques that you've been sending in of your works in progress and questions that you might have. So hopefully this is a helpful way of working. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at this photograph. And I think it's really helpful. So just a quick side note, it's helpful to before you begin a painting, to really sit down and look at it and see what you have available as far as color is concerned and value is concerned, thinking about your hierarchy of focal points, looking at the different areas, comparing them. So just like with value, color is also relative, right? So looking at relative color and looking at, what, this area of the boot, how this area of the boot compares to this area of the boot color-wise, and then maybe this orangish red compares to this orangish red, and then to this one here, and ask yourself, which one's more saturated, which one's more neutral, which one's more yellow, which one's more red, which one has blue in it. So comparing those before you get started, spending a good chunk of time doing what we're going to be doing now, can save you a lot of time when you're actually doing the painting, and it also can allow you to just kind of respond a little bit more, as opposed to stopping and thinking as much while you're painting too. I mean, of course, thinking is always good while you're painting, but so is responding on the fly and trusting, your instincts. So one thing you'll notice is when you're painting is that when you are laying down a color that you lay down initially might look wrong or right when you put it on the canvas, but then once you start getting some other colors around it, that color might then become the opposite of what it was. That color that didn't work will start working. The color that worked will no longer work because of color relativity. Things will keep shifting. So if you're aware of that and kind of mindful of it ahead of time, thinking about how everything relates, you'll be able to keep an eye on things as you progress with the painting, pushing it forward. So it is really helpful to spend some time looking at the photograph beforehand, or looking at your still life and really examining it before you dive right in. And that's what we're going to kind of do now. So if we get our handout, I'm just going to kind of work my way from top to bottom, and no necessarily particular order. The ways that one of the first things I guess we should talk about is going to be, in general, All these color rules, I mean, reality is that if you just look at the still life or the thing that you're going to paint in front of you, it has all of what you need in it. So these rules are just meant to be kind of guides, because every situation is going to be different depending on a million different variables, but they are really helpful to at least have an idea of some of these principles, to know what to look for when you're looking at your still life before you begin painting, and when you're analyzing your painting to decide what is and what is not working. So keep that in mind. There are really not a lot of steadfast rules, but there are a lot of times ones that tend to be pretty frequent in occurrence. So the most frequent in occurrence, and one you can trust the most, is going to be related to light and temperature. So we talked about how every color has an intrinsic temperature, and that temperature is going to be relative to what's around it. So remember, warmer colors will be more towards the red and yellow. Cooler colors will be more towards the blue or the green, most likely blue. The same thing also happens to light. So you can either have a warm light or a cool light. And in general, natural light will be our coolest light. So when you're painting outdoors, or a light is coming through a window and there's no artificial light, most likely that will be a cool light. When you're painting inside, artificial light, we have a pretty wide spectrum these days, are going to be more to the warm spectrum. And in Juneau, we know that pretty well because I hadn't seen it very frequently in my life, but until I moved here, that a lot of times when you walk into someone's home, they have that one warm light, one cool light next to each other in the house to kind of give a balanced spectrum. So it's not too cold, not too warm, kind of right in between. So that is something that you want to look for. Before I go any further into that, I guess I want to also point out, I will post a handout about this light phenomenon of warm and cool in your Blackboard, or however you're receiving these documents for this class, depending on your scenario. So check that out. I'll talk about it again in a second, but look for that. And I also want to talk about the main principles that will affect the color of your object. So remember, we talked about every object will have a local color, right? So this is local color is like a blue-green, and this is a brown or a darker orange or a yellow-red. And then this is a yellow-green local color. Every object will have a local color. There are things that will affect that local color. So when you're dealing with color and painting an object, there are a whole bunch of color shifts that happen in every object. And the things that will affect that local color will be: 1, the temperature of the light; 2, will be the object's local color; and 3, will be the color of the objects around the object that you're looking to paint due to reflective light. So color bounces along with the light into other objects, affecting its local color, changing its temperature, changing its hue. So I'm going to point areas of that out, but I just wanted to mention that now because that will come up in all of the things that we're going to be discussing here. Those are the main principles, or the main things that will affect your color that you're seeing and your color choices. So going back to the light, in Juneau having the one warm, one cool, the reference that I'm putting online for you is, I was washing dishes one day and I was thinking about my painting class that I was teaching, and I looked up at my backsplash in front of me, and I had 2 lights and then 2 little bolts below the lights. And on one side, on the right side, I think it was a warm light. On the left side was a cool light. And when I looked at the little nuts at the end of holding the lights onto the wall, right below it, there was 2 of them, one below each light. Each one had a cast shadow, and each cast shadow was the opposite of the light that was above it. So the basic principle of what your shadow's temperature will be related to the light temperature will be that it will always be the opposite, relatively speaking. So if you have a cool light source, you will then have a relatively warm shadow. If you have a warm light source or a warm light, you'll have a relatively cool shadow. And so they will always be opposite of one another. And if you look at that handout that I put, it's just a picture of that. I took a quick picture to show my students, and you'll see that on the warm side, we have a cool shadow underneath the bolt or the nut, and then on the other side, we have the opposite happening. So check that out, and that principle will remain fairly consistent. So it's a really good idea to first determine, one of the first things you want to look at when you're looking at your painting is to determine the temperature of the light source. And you can usually get a pretty good idea of it by asking, the basic yellow, blue, right? So when we look at this here, this is going to be artificial light coming in, and it is, in general, more towards the warm. And on the shadowed side, in general, they're more towards the cool. Now, I've played a little bit with this in Photoshop to try to make it a little bit more center, just because that's kind of where I like it. I like it to lean a little bit to the cool, but it's still fairly warm, the light source. And the shadows are, if you look at them and you squint, you can see that they kind of go to more of the blue. So if we were to be real specific about it, the light source in this photograph is a little bit to the yellow-orange, and most of the shadows are falling to a blue-purple, right? So that's another, I think, kind of interesting phenomenon that happens, is that regardless of the warm-cool, or in conjunction with the warm-cool, the shadows will usually be the complementary color, relatively speaking, to the light, right? So let's say for some reason we had like a very strong green light source. Most of the shadows would be warm, because green's a cooler color. The shadows would be red and warmer. So they'd be the complementary color. If we had, in this case, bright, let's say this is a really gaudy yellow light source, then these shadows would be almost, straight up into the purple. I have a thing that I usually do in class with different colored light bulbs and a white sphere on a white sheet, and you can really see those differences. However, my technical ability to capture that on the screen was not up to par. So hopefully you guys will take a class with me again at some point when we're in person with one another to show you that. But you can see it really clearly when you look at any of the Impressionist paintings like Monet. Check out any Monet painting, and a lot of the other Impressionists, they play with that kind of phenomenon a lot, where they have those complementary colors built into their warm, cool, warm balance of their light source to their shadow. It creates for a vibrancy, and it also happens to occur fairly frequently in real life. So you want to keep that in mind. That can kind of help you determine what hue or temperature you want to push your shadows into, or your light into. And another thing that you can do to check if you're not sure of the temperature, if you have control of the scene, like if you're outside painting, or if you're in your studio working, and the still life's in front of you, you can just take a white sheet of paper and put it down in a spot. Like this would be a great spot to do it here, or here, and you would be able to see the temperature fairly clearly if it's not obvious to you, just because it shows up very strongly on white. So that can be a good thing to check. So yeah, that's going to be basically when I do paint this in front of you, that's going to be how I'm going to be working, as a warm light and a cooler shadow. Another principle that I kind of wanted to talk about was just basically how form and value relate and work with one another. In general, so we've talked about saturation. We've also, based on our value studies stuff from drawing and from the things that I posted for you online, we know that our darkest part of the object's form shadow is going to be the terminator, right? Or the core shadow. That's going to be a really helpful tool because it gets nice and dark right along that edge of where the light turns into the darkness and the form turns. That's where we get our darkest shadow. That's where there is no light directly hitting it, nor reflective light hitting it, right in that center. And that creates a high contrast at the part of the form that tends to be coming out closest to us. That gives us that illusion of 3 dimensions. So remember, high contrast will pull forward, where minimal contrast will recede in space. And one of the other main rules that plays with that of form is that something of higher saturation will pull forward. So if we look at this part of the boot right here, right, there's a nice high saturation. And then back here, we have definitely low saturation on that lighter pink color. And then right on the edge of the form, we always talk about, gets a little bit darker right on the edge. If we look at that brown compared to this red-brown, the bigger red-brown here is more saturated than here, right, and darker. But that allows this space to fall back and this space to pull forward just based on saturation. And what's nice about form, we'll talk about the saturation on this boot a little bit more as far as pulling things forward and pushing things back. But based on form, though, you'll also notice when you look frequently at objects that the highest saturation, so we said that the highest saturation that a color will usually get is going to be roughly in its midtone. And in general, right before the form turns into the dark, right before that terminator, on the light side, we will get our highest saturation on the form. Will always happen right before we turn into the shadow. So what's nice about that is not only do we have, so it's more right in that area on that pair, but before we have, in addition to having the highest contrast of the shadow side and the light side, at that terminator spot, using value to pull the form forward towards us, we also then have higher saturation at that point as well, working in conjunction with the values to create a stronger sense of form. So if you have and you can really see it right here, on that part of the boot, you see how it gets more saturated. Back here it gets a little grayed out, a little bluer, and down here it's getting a little whiter, a little pinker with a little yellow, but right in that mid-tone, right before it turns into the shadow, we're getting these high saturations right in that area. So if you have a painting where you feel like your values are looking pretty good and your colors are pretty accurate, but it's not pushing the form, look for that higher saturation along those edges of your shadow crossing over into your light. That will really help push your form more. So going back to your basic saturation pulling forward and more neutral or grayed out going back in space. Even if we just look at this boot from here to here to here, you can see that although this is fairly warm and brown, relatively speaking, though, compared to the browns in this area and the warms in this area, this is far more saturated than up here. This starts to get more neutral in this area, and this gets more highly saturated. And then, although it's a different hue, this is more into the red-orange, and this starts to get into a yellow-green up front. This is still fairly saturated. It has a higher value as well, so that is helpful, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I'm talking about a couple other things. But you can see, that by this area being less saturated than this area pulls in front of this area. And this does have its own range of saturations here, but overall, collectively, these are less saturated than down here. And then these here are more saturated, I'd say, a little bit more saturated than here. They're fairly equal. However, the value contrast is stronger there. But this is our main focal point, so it's kind of nice to let these be stronger saturations around that pair. And sorry, I made a lot of marks. Sometimes I get excited about the marks. So look for that. And it happens incrementally and larger in larger spaces too. And we'll take a look at that as well. I mean, if you look right here to right here, this spot is in front and closest to us compared to this. And those aren't that far apart, but you can see even in their saturations that this spot is more saturated, hitting more into the midtones than over here, pulling this in front of this, even though it's in an incremental space, or here to here, right? Or even here to here, or even this space to this space, or this space to that space. These are fairly close. This starts to get more into the mid-tone, and it is closer to these blue-greens, and this is a red-orange, so you're getting complementary colors right next to one another. So anytime you have complementary colors or close to complementary colors, they're going to draw the eye very strongly. So we've talked about how value, high contrast, the eye will be pulled towards. Saturation is the same way. And complementary colors are the same way. So you can use complementary colors and saturation as a way to create space and make things pull in front of other things. But you can also use it to control how the viewer's eye goes through a painting, right? So if we looked at saturation levels, and you can squint and look, this is overall highly more saturated than most of this. And this boot is quite a bit more saturated than most of that vase. That vase starts to get relatively grayed out compared to these two. And then even if you looked at this space from here to here to here, you can see that there's definitely a difference between the saturation levels. This feels more saturated than here. We start to get some nice saturations where we get into the midtones, where there's like the warm light and the cooler shadow, but not deep shadow, more of a midtone shadow. This feels fairly saturated, but not quite as saturated as this, a little bit more grayed out. And this is quite a bit more grayed out. And while we're talking about that, that also brings me to one of the other rules, which is that warmer colors will pull forward and cooler colors will go back in space. So when I look at this boot again, right, if we were to just look at not saturation, and when we squint you can see it really easily, but we would just look at temperature, right? If we look from this spot to, again, that whole area up top, and then this rough area, and then this rough area. If we look at those three spots, you can see that this is not quite as saturated as over here, but it is warmer here than here, right? It's getting a little cooler as it goes back this way, and then it's getting even cooler as it's going back this way. So not only are we having saturation to play with to get that space, now we can also use our color temperature to pull this in front of this and this in front of that. So playing with your temperatures can also help create the illusion of space in a painting and make things more interesting to look at. So if we were to just look at temperatures, when we squint, this is more yellow-red. Here we start to get, we have a little bit of this warmer color in this area, this warmer light, but in general, this starts to go more blue. And a little bit of green, but mostly more blue. And then back here we get a lot of kind of a blue-green going on, right? So we have a big space happening temperature-wise between these three spots. And then even if you look in here, right? So in this shadow space in here, do you see how we're getting, although relatively all of this is cooler, than the light side. If we just look from this space to this space, do you see how this all feels cooler? It almost starts to go blue-green relative, and this starts to go red-yellow relative, right? Still all cooler than over here, but there is temperature change even within this shadowed space itself. And that's something to look for anytime you can see that incremental shadow difference. So another one's going to be, so this will be warmer, right? And this is relatively cooler. But then if we look at this space compared to these spaces here, do you see it gets a little bit, I'm going to get rid of more of those marks so you can see the colors. So I'll do a little mark. We have more red, and then that feels blue. But when we focus our eye here and compare it to here, even that little triangle right back there, if we compare to that space, do you see how this space starts to go more green? And that starts to feel more red as opposed to blue before. And then as we work our way out this way, we're getting cooler and cooler and cooler as we go this way. And it starts to get a teeny bit of warmth popping in because you get a little bit of reflective light breaking up that shadow. The coolest spots are going to be in the deeper shadows because that's where less warm light is bouncing inside. So like here and down there are going to be the coolest. So all kind of tools that you can use to create that illusion of space. And you can use them interchangeably. So like when I look at, again, this boot space, this is, well, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the pair 2 here in a second. But if you look at this boot space, you know, I want this to be my focal point. This is the highest. We have 2 complementary colors. We have green next to red. And we have high value contrast, right? And it's the closest object to the light source, closest area to the light source. And it's also one of the lightest local value objects next to one of the darker local value objects. And we also have high saturation happening in this area because of the pair's color and the boot's color. So I want this to be my focal point, but I don't want this part of the boot to pull in front of this part of the boot. And I don't want this part of the boot to pull in front of this part of the boot. So you can use these tools interchangeably. And I don't want any of this to pull in front of I want all of this to pull in front of this, right? So you can use all of these tools kind of at different times to your advantage. Sometimes it's a straightforward shot. Sometimes it is kind of a multi-pronged approach, right? So, you can use your temperatures. So, this is not as warm as this. So, in the painting that I'm going to be doing coming up, I think I chose to push this yellow, right, and use the yellow, but I had to kind of neutralize it. I didn't want it to compete with this yellow. So I had to kind of push it, and when you look at it, it's got a little bit of a green hue to it, relatively speaking, than the colors around it. So I kind of used it neutrally and relied more heavily on value in the yellow, but more on the value here, right? The dark and the dark around this light. And then here, I pushed the saturation to make sure that this pulled in front of this, and then allowed having less contrast happening back here around it for this to not pull, this area to not pull in front of this area. And I don't know if it helps that I keep scribbling on the areas that I'm talking about. I'll try to do bigger circles maybe. But you can see that I'm relying on sometimes on value and temperature, sometimes on saturation, and then sometimes on value contrast of an area. And, this we could get a little more neutral, right? So this is more neutral than this area. So the value contrast combined with saturation to push it back. So you can kind of use them interchangeably depending on the needs of that painting to create that space. So you have a lot more tools than just value contrast and detail or detail to create that illusion of space. And then again, if we look at just the, we have our high saturation zone right here on this guy. Even when we look at, saturation zones, if you were to look at just basically warm, cool, do you guys see that along this terminator? Let's look at this again. Along this terminator edge, the values shift, right? So it's the darkest part of the terminators here and here, right? Pulling both of these in front. But this you start to get higher contrast around it. And this is a little bit darker here than here, but not by too much, just by a little bit. So one thing we can do, though, is if we look and squint, you can see that this is warmer, relatively speaking, than this dark here, right? So this, and what's right around it, is warmer as well. That this being a little bit warmer, that part of the terminator, than this part of the terminator, will pull this part of the vase in front of that part of the vase, even though their values are relatively close to one another. Just the shadows. Now the lights are different, right? The light is definitely brighter down here than up here, so that's going to help. But then we can also play with the saturation. And there's some reflective light that is also playing a little bit of cool in there. But that blue next to that orange is also going to be, so that having that saturation a little more intense here can also pull this in front of this. But there's even in that kind of approach, so even when you're looking at just one element of value, you can create that illusion of space pretty much every brush stroke. So that's why I was showing you, having you practice with value, doing the tiled approach, like one mark at a time and changing your value every mark. It's so that when you start doing color, you're also doing that same approach. So when you're, every time you have a color that changes to another color, or a value shift that happens every time you change the value or you change the temperature of something, you will be creating a new color. So whether it's an incremental change or a large shift from here to here, you will always be changing the color. So being cognizant of that as you're painting, and picking the right color for an area, with that in mind, based on these principles of space related to saturation and temperature, can make a significant difference in your painting. So I kind of jumped off track on what we were looking at here. Okay, so if we're looking at our pear, right, it's cooler back here and getting warmer as we roll forward. Right, this whole thing is warming as we go, so that's going to help pull this part of the pear in front of this part of the pear. We're also going to be getting lighter and warmer as we go this way. And then cooling a little bit on that back edge. So let's jump back to the sheet here and look at what's else on the list. So we have at the very top, not very far down, I kind of jumped over this, but you want to remember, and we talked a little bit about it, but you want to, even though, I think we were talking about it down here, so even though this is cool relative to this, even within the cool shadow area, there will be relative warm and relative dark. Relative warm and relative cool, right? So it won't be all just one temperature within the cool. It just needs to be relatively all cooler than the light side. And same thing happens on the light side. So on a light side form, the form of a light side, we will have both. So if you look here and you look here, we have both a cool, warm light and a warmer midtone or light on the light side, right? So it's not just all warm. It's relatively warm and cool next to one another on the light side when we're comparing just light to light. But then both of these are going to be, for the most part, warmer than anything over here. And then on the shadowed cooler side, we have both cooler and warmer happening as well. So you want to keep that in mind. The more you have that warm-cool alternation happening on bigger spectrums from shadowed side to light side, and smaller spectrums from light side compared to another light side area to turn the form, the more interesting it is, and the more vibrancy you'll get in your piece, and it mimics life quite a bit more that way. And you can use that subtle tool to turn the form as well, right? So let's look at this here. So I don't know if you guys can see it, but this photo's a little grainy, but do you see how right here it gets cooler and bluer? And right here it gets a little cooler and bluer. That's because what we're looking at there is the actual local value or the local color of the object. Everywhere else, it's harder to see on the light side or on the dark side because of how dark it is. And in general, that's also true because in general, you will have more saturation on the light side and more neutral on the shadowed side. So you'll have less saturation in your shadows, stronger saturation on the light side. So it's a little harder to see in the shadow because of that. It's actual local color. But right here we see that the reason it's going that blue is because these two spots here and here are the two spots that aren't getting any of the orange bouncing from the boot into it at different levels. So you see how if it's a downward facing plane like here, it's getting a stronger orange to it compared to maybe this area here that is more straight across from it and straight across from a shadowed area. And it's a more flat planar part of it. And then here it's getting a little warmer again because it's catching quite a bit more of this light hitting here and a little bit of the warm light itself more directly. And then down here it's getting quite a bit oranger, right, from the boot bouncing into that green. So reflective light will play a huge role in it, and also just the colors of what's around it. So why that's happening here and here is because this up here is catching no reflective light from the boot, no reflective color from the boot. Even if you look right here, you know, that whole rim is getting less than a lot of the other areas of the bottle, but this area is warmer and catching just a little bit along that ridge. It's catching a little bit, not as much orange as down here, just a little bit up in here. So that being warmer and a little bit lighter pulls in front of this, which is being cooler and bluer in the back, catching no reflective light, right? So just by having those principles playing there, we get a lot of space and depth. So what is around something color-wise will play into it. So it's always good to ask yourself, what is color being reflected in affecting the local color, and what is the actual areas that are local color that has no reflective color bouncing into it. It's very rare that you see an area that does not, but it's good to look for. So that's another good principle. I'm still kind of jumping around a little bit, so hopefully you guys are hanging in there. Based on space though, right? So if we look in this area here, let's look at the whole thing, including the shadow. So if we look at this whole area of that vase, you can see how we can rely on saturation and warmth. So it's warmer here, right? And then as we roll this way, it's getting, as we roll this way around the vase, it's getting less saturated and cooler relative to here, right? So that's kind of helping turn that form this way by playing with that warm, cool, and the saturation to help turn a small part of the form. And then when we look at the shadowed side as well, we're getting, it's warmer here, right, at that terminator, and then it's getting less saturated. So it's warmer and more saturated, and it's getting less saturated in that middle section, and as it comes towards the edge of that form, it is getting darker and cooler and less saturated as well. So it's slowly getting less saturated and cooler incrementally and relatively as it's rolling around the form. So you can see how you can get really into changing your color about every time you change your value. So it's a good practice, one, just to look and observe, and then also get it on the canvas. So I'm going to kind of jump down through this list. So darkest darks and lightest lights will pull forward, saturation pulls forward, muted colors will recede, warmer colors pull forward, cooler colors will recede. Complementary colors, when placed next to one another, will draw the eye more than any other combination. This is only trumped by high value contrast. So high value will always trump the complementary color game, but they do both draw the eye fairly intensely. And then when a painting becomes chalky, and we'll look at mine to see if I had any chalky areas, but essentially if you get an area that's chalky where it just feels like white and kind of just lackluster area, you'll know it when you see it. If it gets chalky, it means that you only added usually, and I talked a little bit about it in the color mixing videos, when you add too much white to something and you don't vary that temperature, right? So in this scenario, you can see it's challenging. So and you'll see when I'm doing the painting in real life, I wanted to lighten, and in this case it worked nicely because I wanted to push this to a green a little bit. But as you try to lighten an area, right, and you have a warm light source, every time you add white to a color, let's say I want to lighten this green, every time I add white to it, it's going to start getting cooler. But I want to reserve that cool for the shadowed side, so I always need to add a little bit of yellow back into it as I push it forward. If you're just adding white, it's going to get cooler and cooler, and it's not going to be the right temperature for that area of the painting, relatively speaking, to what's around it, or to your light sources balance of warm-cool. So if an area looks chalky, check its value, but more importantly, check its temperature. It might be too cool or too warm. Typically it's usually more of the temperature than it is, or it's just the wrong color for that area. Oftentimes less the value, but more either the wrong color or the wrong temperature. It might be the wrong hue. But again, that's a little bit more onto the temperature side than anything. A painting becomes muddy when a color loses its identity. So you might have had that happen before. You just starts to look like nothing. It's not one thing or another, and you put it down and it looked different on the palette, and you put it up there. It just means with what's around it and the color that you put down, it just got mixed too much in the middle with its complementary color, so it loses its identity of what hue it is. It will also look muddy on the canvas if it's, again, the wrong temperature. So if you go to put a brush stroke down and it just looks like someone smeared mud literally on your canvas, then it's probably should be a cool and you put a warm down, or it should be, which I think happens most, or it should be a cool and you put a warm down, or the opposite. So check again the temperature, and then check the value. It could just be also the wrong value if it looks muddy, too dark, usually the case. And then at the bottom, it just says color harmony, split complementary colors. So there are a lot of formulas out there that you can play with. Van Gogh used the split complementary color palette quite a bit. And, I tend to not follow those, mostly because I like experimenting. Color's such a personal thing, how we all see color, how we choose our colors, mix them, respond to what we put down with the next mark, that even if we're all painting realism, we still get so wide of a variety that, following a formula is good as far as the split complementary colors, that sort of thing, for the sake of learning about color theory. But I think the best thing that you can do is just mix and paint, and look for these basic principles playing out in front of you, and then use the principles that we talked about in the mixing video to be successful. So, and then as far as color harmony is also concerned, kind of a quick fix that you can do is called the dipping pot method, which is essentially, if you want harmony, just always making sure that you have a little bit of one color mixed in with every color that you do. So if every color that I mixed on here just had a teeny bit or a lot, depending on the color, of alizarin crimson, then I would get color harmony. Or if I had a little bit of the cadmium yellow light, then everything would share a color that would help unite it. Now, you don't have to worry about that as much when you're using a limited color palette, which is what I painted with when I did the demo, because it all is kind of it's all kind of working with each other already anyways, and you have to use almost one color in all of them, or all colors in most of your mixtures. So but if you start to expand your color palette and things start to feel disjointed, some people will do like a light glaze of an alizarin crimson over the whole thing to kind of give everything a little bit of a color shared shift with one another, or just the dipping pot where everything always gets just a teeny bit of that, if not a lot, depending on the local color of the object and area of the painting. So that's a way to get kind of a simplified color palette or a color harmony, I think easily as well. But I think, color harmony is a personal thing as well. Again, best thing you can do is to just paint and decide what you like and don't like and what works together and what doesn't for you. That's the basic rundown of looking at this. I think hopefully that was helpful, and there's probably a whole bunch on here that I know there's a bunch on here that I didn't get to talk about as far as those things are concerned. So spend some time looking at it before you start watching the demo yourself and look. And then just as far as the demo is concerned, I basically took one of the really incomplete versions. I saved the better version because I did 2 demos of the same painting for you guys. One was just I left at the burnt sienna stage, and the other I closed out with the partially closed out in certain areas. I took the partially closed out one. I know all of you are at kind of different spots in this painting process just because of class being the way it's been. So I thought it'd be good to demo in a few different style approaches and at different varying stages. So I'm going to save the good one for something different. The more refined, I guess, underpainting, and the one that was less so is what I grabbed. And I had actually just meant to test the lighting and the recording process, because I'm going to be, I recorded it so that you could see my palette in one part of the video at the same time as seeing the canvas as I paint it, so you can see what color choices I'm choosing. And I meant to just do it as just kind of a warm-up and practice recording it, and then I just kind of got into it. So and I think it worked pretty well. So I basically worked really fast for me. I think it was about an hour and a half to get the painting pretty far along. I didn't talk at all, which I think will be interesting. So because it kind of require you to ask questions. So I really encourage you to watch thoughtfully and ask yourself, why, based on the principles that we just talked about, why is he, making that color that way? It might look weird at first, and then it might kind of pull together. Or if it doesn't, ask yourself why. What might have you done different, or what could I have done different in mixing that color that I put up there? So be conscious of what I'm doing. So if you see me, work this area for a while, and then this area, and then I come and I push this area, and then this area, but then right after this area, I come back up and shift this area and maybe this area next to this area. Ask yourself why. Was there, and even rewind it to kind of see if you could figure out what I was thinking. And the reason I say that is because I was the kind of main goals that I kind of set out in this faster painting was I just set up my intent. So my intent for that was to, for this painting, when I started out, is I wanted to really be paying attention to color temperature and saturation to create space, and to really just build the basic form. I don't have a lot of little minute transitions or details. I'm really looking at the overall relationships and then pushing some of the detail in. And we'll talk about, in an indirect method, you can do that and then come back in later, and once it's dried, and then build on top of that the details that you need, and do the shifts, even more subtle shifts that you need in temperature and value, and correct anything along the way, which we'll talk about after we watch the demo. But those were my main intents, was to really focus on the color temperatures and the saturations and the relation to one another, as opposed to being a little more form-based in my painting. As far as value, I was really thinking a lot about color temperature and saturation. So, and of course value, but so look at that, watch it, and I'm interested to know what you guys think. Hopefully it's helpful. Hope you enjoy it, and I will see you after the video to look at the painting and talk about it a little bit. All right.